corsetry. You're going to get a little bit of the history, a little bit of how to make them, and then there's a chance for questions, and there's also where to get them, or where the ones that I like you can get if you don't want to make your own, because they are fun. So, next slide. First of all, the history of corsets. This is a photograph of the earliest model depicting corsets. And this is from the kind of Crete area, about 1600 BC. The corset is basically being worn as outerwear, and it is the snake goddess. So this is where corsets first started. Next slide. Okay, so over the years, the shapes of corsets have changed quite a lot. Now, this doesn't actually start at the earliest corsets, or as they were called, pairs of bodies or stays. So if you hear anyone talking about a pair of bodies, what they're actually talking about is this. I've got it. So it is in two pieces, and it literally laces front and back, and you're squished in the middle. This one is actually based on 1640s stays. It is made for me. It's an arse to get into and out of. This one is actually laced in a particular way, which I'll go through a little bit later. The reasons for corsets is partly for support. It's support for your back, and it's support for the front. As you can see, as time's gone on, from the earliest corsets, they basically weren't very shaped. They were just very flat and basically went with a squish. Squish and up. And it supported everything, and then as they started getting better and having machines to help them, you could add in more seams, which then gave you more interesting shapes of the corsets themselves. And as you can see, you go right the way through. Some of them are designed to give you a very small waist compared to shoulders and hips. Some of them are designed to give you what's called an S-bend, which basically means that your front is fairly flat and it's aimed to make your arse look bigger. Because a lot of the time, when corsets were being made, the bigger you looked, so the more curves you had, the richer you were. So part of it was trying to give you that status symbol of, I'm rich enough to eat. Now, the other reason for the corsets is to actually provide a basis for the clothing to work on. Our natural bodies haven't really changed shape that much over the years. So to be able to get those distinctive silhouettes of the Victorians, the Regency period and things like that, they used corsets to change them. Now, next slide. It wasn't just the women that wore corsets. Men also wore corsets, again, to provide the shape that they needed. So as you can see, sometimes the shape is very similar to the females. In the 16th and 17th century, the corsets weren't just worn as underwear, they were also boned into the jackets and the clothing that they wore as an outer layer, and they actually had to be helped into them because trying to do them up yourself is actually quite hard. And again, all the way through to the Victorian times, men still wore corsets to try and emphasise a small waist and bigger shoulders. And anyone who's worn a corset, if you found that your corset hurts, that means that it doesn't actually fit well. If you're wearing a corset that is properly fitted for you, it doesn't hurt. Next slide. Parts of the corset. So, very simply, at the very front with the hook and eyes, that is called your basque or your busk. Normally made of metal, though they were originally made of wood or reed with hand-sewn eyelets. And yes, those eyelets do take a little while to go. At the back, you've got where the lacing is. Now, in the early days of corsets, if you had a back-laced corset, generally that meant that you were higher status. If you had a front-laced corset, or pair of bodies or stays, it showed that you were actually more lower class, because if you have the front lacing, you don't actually need to have help to do that.
Can I interrupt you for one second? Is anyone here in this room going to entering masquerade? Who are you? As
Angel, Tia, and Group.
Angel, Tia, Group. Is it just one group? Andy? Yep. You guys are good. You know what you're doing?
Yep. Yeah.
Then you don't need to come to the briefing. Because this runs through the briefing, so I'll just...
Okay. What time do you show up then?
Well, I knew that's where the camera's at, so we could leave.
What time do we show up?
5 o'clock.
Oh, cool. Right. Yeah.
Usual time. I think it's 5. Let me double check, sorry.
Yes, I was going to leave the camera running so I could come in, but if I don't have to go.
They need to be there at 5.
Okay.
5 o'clock, the other room, usual.
Right. Thank
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so as I was saying, the front of the corset, if it was a front laced, then that showed that you were slightly lower class, because it meant you didn't need as much help to actually get dressed. If it's back laced, then it meant that you had help, and you could afford that help. Some people, of course, would use their family members to actually help them. Now, one of the things that people do now is they don't always put the corsets on right, but I'll go on to that in a little bit more detail in a bit. And then, of course, you've got the bones, which go up and down the length of the corset. Next slide. Can everyone in this room read? Yeah? Have a read. Or take photos, absolutely fine. If I can work out how to put the slides with writing and links on Facebook later, I will. I am not guaranteeing this because that may stretch my technical abilities.
You can save it as a PDF and that's a lot easier to upload onto Facebook.
Good shout. Has everyone finished that slide? Yeah? Okay, move on to the next one. Okay. History of corsets, as I said, is a huge subject. These are just a couple of the links with fairly good online resources. The history of corsets is massive because although corsets were predominantly worn in the West, there are examples from all over the world. The subject itself is absolutely fantastic, fascinating and fantastic because if you actually start looking at the history of what the boning was, to start off with, the most common form of boning was reed. So literally the reeds from the sides of the rivers. A lot of the 17th century corsets were boned with reed or with willow, things that they could find lying around. The more upmarket corsets tended to be boned with whalebone because it was a very malleable, easily carved medium, so you could actually get the curves to where you wanted it. And then as steel and things like that became more available, it tended to move to steel because it was a cheaper alternative to whalebone. Go on to the next slide. What can you do in a corset? So we've got a little video. Now, if it works. I do have permission to show this video, but she wanted me to stream it rather than show it. If it doesn't...
Have you seen it?
No.
Nope.
I think the answer is it's not going to work. Okay, on Facebook there is a lady called, a page called Prior Attire. Now, she has done an awful lot. She is a vendor, she does sell them, but she has actually got... No, I think we're just going to give up on that one. But she's actually got a video on her Facebook page, which is a public page, which basically shows everything that you can do in a corset that's in a well-fitting corset. So some of the things that she's done is she's fought in boxing matches, she's ridden horses, pegged the washing out, gone ice skating, driven a car, ridden a bike. Anything you can do normally, you can do in a corset.
Oh, has that worked?
It almost did. We knew that tech was going to go wrong at some point. Yeah, we may have done other things, and when the pair of us are in charge of anything to do with tech, it goes wrong. And the only things that I would say is when putting on a corset, put your shoes on first. Those of you who haven't tried wearing a corset, no, just give up. Those of you who haven't tried, the main reason why putting your shoes on is a problem, it is possible. There are particular ways of putting shoes on while wearing corsets. It's just easier before you either lace it or put it on.
Did you want the next slide?
Yeah. Now, wearing a corset correctly, first of all, you've got to make sure that it fits properly. If a corset doesn't fit properly, it will hurt. It will pinch, it can pinch the skin, it will feel like it is constricting you. A decent corset won't actually constrict you, it won't hamper your movement. You will be able to do anything if your corset fits right. The other thing to work out with corsets is how to actually put them on. Now, I know in all the films you see it where someone's put the corset on, knee in the back, and yank. That is the worst thing you can do. The reasons for this is multiple. So first of all, when you do that, you're actually putting strain on the corset itself, and you're putting strain on the bones and the lacings. And by doing that, you're going to break the corset and you're going to break yourself. The most comfortable way of wearing a corset is to actually start, depends on how often I've been wearing a corset recently, but I normally start about an hour before I need to be fully dressed. And I'll put the corset on and I'll lace it and tighten it. When I'm on my own, I do wear back-laced corsets. My best friend is a doorknob or a bedpost. So when you actually have the corsets themselves, when you've got the lacings, you have two loops. This one's actually spiral bound, so it may not have them. I can't remember, no, that's just spiral bound. So you actually have the loops in the middle of the corset, in the middle of your back, and basically you pull them and then go down your back and just pull, 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 bring it out. You have the two loops on the end of bedpost, doorknob, anything else like that, and just pull it until you can feel it, but it's not tight. Then you tie it off, finish getting dressed, do your makeup, sort yourself out, cook your lunch, do whatever you want. 15-20 minutes later, your corset has warmed up. And what this means is it means that the fabrics that the corset is actually made of have actually started to warm up, become more flexible, and started to mould to your body. So about half hour in, I'll again go back to my doorknob, my handy doorknob or bedpost, hook the ends over and start walking forwards, because it's the way that I've found works for me. And then what you need to do is you need to make sure that you're actually making the lacings even down the back of where you're going, because what you don't want to do is you don't actually want to have past the corset really wide, going into really tiny, going out to wide. What that's actually doing is that's putting undue pressure onto points of your body and points of the corset. All of these things will mean that the eyelets will start to go, then you have to redo them, you'll never be able to get a metal eyelet back onto it, and then you'll have to hand stitch the damn things. And eyelets are fun. They're not difficult, they're not complex, they're really easy to do, but they take forever. So once you've tightened it up a bit more, then you finish doing whatever you want to do, and then as you're leaving, you tie it off and tighten it again. And I find that that works for me to then get it to where I am comfortable with how tight the corset is. What you will find, and I always find this, is halfway through the night I'm going, I've got a wiggle, and then I can turn my corset round again, because I'm one of these lucky people who is actually corset shaped. Not everyone can do that, but for me, it just happens. Now, food and drink in corsets. You can eat, you can drink whatever you want in a corset. Doesn't matter who you are, some things work better for you than others. So, one of my mates who wears a corset a lot, when they're in a corset, they cannot drink fizzy drinks. It just doesn't work. They find that the corset then becomes really uncomfortable. Me, on the other hand, I can drink fizzy drinks as much as I want in a corset. What I can't drink, or what I can't eat, is crisps. It's something to do with the salt. So you need to work out what works for you. And the corsets, I love corsets. I love wearing corsets. I have 15 of the things. I could only find one coming to Minami today, or on Thursday. It's one of them. So the one I've got here is all hand stitched. I will, if you want to have a look at it later, you are more than welcome to. The other thing you need to be aware of is taking the corset off. Now, as I was saying before, corsets are really good at supporting. And they support all your back muscles, they support your core. And when you've been wearing a corset for a little while, when you suddenly take the corset off, you get something that I call, and a lot of my mates call, the jelly back feeling. And it feels like your back is a bowl of jelly, and it just kind of goes wibble and feels like it can't actually hold you up. The way to stop this is, rather than taking the corset straight off, is you loosen it. Wait a little bit, loosen it a bit more, and that gives your muscles a chance to acclimatise back to actually having to work. Yes, you can of course take it straight off. The effects of jelly back for me normally last for about 10 minutes, and then I'm fine. But it is something to be aware of. Next slide. Right, into the makings of corsets. So, when you make a corset, I am not clever enough to make my own block. I am not clever enough to make my own pattern for a corset. So I rely on patterns, either from books, where they have little grid lines and then you take the pattern pieces and then you alter them to your shape, or you can buy pre-made patterns that you then alter. When making a corset, you must make a toile. When you make your corsets, and when you first make one, it won't fit. And you will do all this work, and if you're anything like me, it then gets thrown across the other end of the room when it's really uncomfortable, and you just kind of sit in a corner and cry for a bit because you've just wasted 20 hours on something that you've used the best fabric for, and it doesn't fit. So always make a toile out of something just to check that it fits. And that is the point where I tend to use the cheaper boning options. But the patterns and the books that I recommend are Patterns of Fashion, which is Janet Arnold. You need to get them directly from the School of Historical Dress, because they actually took over the Janet Arnold event. If you look for them on Amazon or eBay, you will be paying over £100 for a £40 book. The Big Five, so that by the Big Five I mean Simplicity, Burda, McCall's, patterns like that. They do customisable corsets that will fit most people. You just need to pick the size you want and adjust it as you want. They're perfectly good, perfectly reasonable. I have actually used that one. It works. I have fairly major adjustments on it, but that's me and my shape. Etsy. There's a lot of different designers on Etsy who have different corset patterns. There is Stays and Corsets by, that should be Mandy Barrington. I have made a spelling mistake and I've just noticed. And that is on both Kindle and Amazon or your preferred retailer. Stays and Corsets and Patterns of Fashion both go through how to make a block for your particular shape, your particular way, and guide you through step by step how to make your own patterns. I'm working on it, but I'm not good enough yet. So those are some of the places where you can get patterns. Next slide. If you don't want to make your own, these are some of the places that I would go. White Phantom does the most amazing corsets ever, but she is expensive. These are all some of the smaller corset places that you can buy them. There are others. Corset Story is probably the cheapest of the lot because they are mass-produced corsets. I've put them in there because they do work, they are there. Would I recommend them? It's up to you, but just make sure it fits and it doesn't hurt. But yeah, those are some of the ones where you can go to if you don't want to make your own. There are more on Etsy, there's more dotted around, but those are the ones that I've been in contact with recently. Next one. Right, to make your corsets. Right, Tom is the original reenactors market. They have, probably good for all kinds of different things, but they've got all kinds of fabric dealers, patterns, reconstructing history normally have something there with patterns. There's also leather suppliers and all kinds of different bits and pieces. Vina Cava, they specialise in corsetry accessories, haberdashery. So you can get a lot of the boning and things. They've been going for donkey's years. They're not always the cheapest, but they are, again, they're a reliable source. I tend to use the wonderful world of eBay because a lot of the time you can get stuff fairly cheap. Again, you can get stuff on Etsy for the boning. Wire cutters. Wire cutters you need to have if you want any form of metal boning. Trying to cut metal boning with scissors doesn't work. You can bend it, you can snap it by bending it, it's patience, and then you end up with some really rough edges which are an absolute pain to sand down. Thread, you will need decent quality thread. You can either use a sewing machine or hand sew corsets. If you are going to hand sew them, it takes time. Perfectly happy to do it. It's not difficult, it's just time consuming. So I tend to use a sewing machine because it's quicker. Fabric. Fabric is the most important thing that you will need apart from the boning for the corset. So in the middle of the corset you have, so the corset is generally, mine tend to be 4 layers. You can have more, you can have less. So the reason I have 4 layers is because I cheat with my bones. I will sew an inner piece and an outer inner piece. I will sew the two together and then I will stitch channels wherever it says, rather than actually trying to put them in the seams. And that is my preference. Different people and different patterns say to do it different ways, but that's the way that I do it. With that inner fabric, that is the fabric which gives you the shape. And this fabric needs to be a fairly thick, dense fabric. I tend to use a cotton duck. I am a reenactor, so theoretically I should use linen, but it can't be seen, so I tend to use cotton because it's cheaper and more available. And it's a very, very thick canvas-like fabric, and that is what gives you the strength, and that is what gives you the shape, as well as the boning. And then you have on the outside If you are going for some of the more traditional ones, you then have a liner, a corset liner, because wearing a corset directly next to your skin, if you get it wrong when you're lacing it hurts. Because you will get your skin caught between the laces and the eyelets, and the pull of the lacing over your skin can cause burns. Been there, done that, worn that t-shirt, it's really not fun. So always try and make sure you've got something in between the corset and your skin, or that you're very, very careful. Then over the top you have your pretty fabrics, the ones that you actually see. So you've got your inner core, and then you've got your pretty fabrics that make the corset look nice. So all in all, generally with most corsets you actually make 4 fabric pieces. Sew the inner 2, put the bones into the inner ones, and then the outside or the cover is what goes over the top if you're looking to hide the boning. If you are looking to make it obvious that you do have bones in your corset, then there are different ways of construction, but the pattern that you use and the way you do that will actually tell you what you're doing with that. Boning. As I said, whalebone was the original thing. There is such a thing as synthetic whalebone. I don't particularly like it. Zip ties. You know when I said about making your toile, or your toile? Zip ties are your friend. So, do you want to? Yes, I have lots of zip ties with me. Zip ties are both washable, reusable, and they can be as good as metal boning for your toiles. If you don't need as much support, then zip ties work. Generally, I will put 2 or 3 together for the bones for mine. And the other thing with the zip ties is the fact that they're cheap. So when you're making your toiles, you can get the feel, you can get the shape, you can get the boning of them, but it's a lot cheaper and a lot easier than actual metal boning. So, whalebone, as I said, isn't something that we use nowadays because killing whales for their bones isn't exactly the done thing anymore. And apart from that, I don't like that idea at all. So, you've got synthetic whalebone, you've got flat steel. Now, I need help. So we've got flat steel, that's the white one.
Oh, the white one.
You've got flat steel, which I've got 2 lots in there. You've got the white one, yes, it will spring. Be careful, it will go everywhere. It's literally a piece of steel covered in plastic that goes in the middle. We then have the black one won't spring because I've cable tied that one. The black one is a much narrower one, which I use for more decorative corsets, but this one is actually fabric covered. So I'll send that one around that way. Now, the last ones that we've got, or that I've got here, are something called sprung steel, or spring steel. Spring steel, when it's on a roll, is very slippery and goes everywhere. Now, spring steel is literally a flattened spring. When you get it, if you get it on a roll, it, as I said, it is a spring, it's coiled, it goes everywhere. What you need for the spring steel is you need caps. So when you cut the spring steel itself, you then basically put a cap on each end, which are then, you then use a pair of pliers to go through and make it so that it's not going to cut your hands. Because it is a spring, all of the metal ones, if you are not careful, do cut your hands when you're cutting them. do cut your skin. If you happen to make a mistake and not case them properly in your corset, please make sure you finish all your edges and make sure you've actually bound the wires in. Those of you who have ever worn anything underwired like, if you've ever had your underwire escape, it's a bit like that. If you don't, it's basically a point that pokes directly into wherever the metal meets, and it's a bit of a pain, but it works. Then you move on to the more plastic boning. So there is something called Ridgeline, which is a plastic boning. The plastic boning, the Ridgeline and the plastic bonings do work. A lot of people really like them. I personally don't. Yeah. I do have some corsets here which have Ridgeline in it. It's much flimsier, and if you happen to have bent over or done something to your corset or managed to get it folded in a drawer, the Ridgeline will keep that bend. With metal, you can generally straighten it out. With Ridgeline, you have no chance. And that bend will stay in whatever you've made forever after. And it gets really annoying when you go to put it on and you discover you've got a right angle bend sticking into you right where you don't want it. So I don't like it, but other people do. Reeds. It is still possible to bone your corset with reeds. Reeds I can get from eBay, Etsy, or I'm very lucky, I have permission to go get the reeds from the river. And then I dry them out and everything else. They are a bit of a pain to do, but they do work. And with the reeds and the willow, so by willow I literally mean willow sticks. With both the reeds and the willow, what does happen is when I was saying about your corset warming up and your corset warming up to the shape of your body, the reeds and the willow are the ones that will give the most as they warm up. Next one. Construction. Right, you've got your pattern pieces. First of all, if you have made your own pattern out of your own block, please make sure you add seam allowance. Again, speaking from experience here, if you are making your pattern and you don't add seam allowance, if you have 8 pieces in your corset and you have 1/2 centimetre on each side that you need to use for the seam, that's what, 4 centimetres that you've lost from your corset? And that 4 centimetres is very possible that that goes from, this is a really nice fitting corset, to, whoops. And what you will find is the fact that things like your arms, if you are wearing a high corset, which is for both men and women, fairly high up at the front and high up at the back, you have a cutout for your arms. If you make a mistake with the seam allowance, you end up with the pointy up bit where your arm should be, or should be either side of your arm, you end up with this pointy up bit directly into your armpit.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. And if you have this pointy up bit in your armpit, this does constrict movement. This does cause bruising in your underarm. If you've ever had a bruise in your underarm, they hurt because you constantly have pressure on them. Please remember from my mistakes. So as I said, seam allowance. Now, if you are using one of the big 5, so if you're using Simplicity, McCall's, Burda, Vogue, generally they have a seam allowance of 1.5 centimetres. If you are using patterns from Reconstructing History or any of the Etsy designers, you need to make sure that you read the instructions as to what the seam allowance is. Because again, the problem is the fact that if you take too little seam allowance, you end up with a corset that can be up to 3 sizes too big. If you take too much, again, you've got the same problem, that it's too small. If you are looking at making the early ones, so the kind of the stays and bodies, you will also have something called a stomacher, which basically is a piece of normally wood that goes down the middle and basically stops your stomach sticking out when you've had some food. And this is for both the men and the women's corsets. When you have that little bit of a food baby after you've eaten a little bit, what the stomacher does is it pushes everything down. How to attach the boning. Now, as I said, I don't always follow the patterns. When I am making my inner corset, I will create tubes and basically push the boning down into the tube. If you are doing it in the seam, the instructions will tell you how they expect you to do it, because this can alter your seam allowances and things like that. But generally you will create some form of tube. For the metal boning, for the Ridgeline boning or the plastic boning, a lot of the time you can literally just sew over it. One of the other ways that you can do the boning is to literally make your corset up, do exactly as you want, and then you put some little bias binding-y type strips down the side of the corsets and feed your bones in. With all of these methods, as I said, you do need to make sure that first of all, if you are using any of the metal boning, make sure you have finished the ends. So like the spring steel that was sent round, you saw that that had caps on the end. With the plastic covered and the fabric covered boning, make sure you cover the ends either with fabric, metal, caps, even gaffer tape or masking tape will do. The reasons for this is, again, if you think about how sharp those corners of the metal are, that boning will destroy the fabric, and you'll end up with that boning coming all the way out of your nice pretty corset that you finished immaculately, that you wear maybe twice. The friction between your body and the corset boning will then make it tear the fabric, and that bone will then start popping out, which then means that you've got to then repair the corset, and it doesn't look as pretty. But that again is a purely aesthetic thing. It's not something, if you forget, it's not the end of the world. You may be lucky. If you're unlucky, the worst that will happen is you'll manage to cut yourself. Finishing it off. So when you're finishing corsets, depending on how you are doing it, some of them will have bindings, which go all the way around the top, all the way around the bottom, and up the middle. If you have a corset that has a binding, if you make sure that your boning is literally 3-4 mil shorter than your channel, you can then use the sewing machine to go all the way around. If you make your boning exactly the same length, you are going to have to hand stitch that binding on. And the reason for this is the fact that unless you are using plastic boning or the zip ties, your sewing machine is unlikely to go through the bones. There are some sewing machines that will go through metal bones. They are very expensive, generally industrial, and I have used them. They are fun, but they are also very difficult to get the hang of because they go a lot faster than a domestic machine. When you finish them off, you then need to work out how you are going to do your eyelets. So if you're looking at a modern corset, the easiest way is to get a metal eyelet maker, get your metal eyelets and put them in. If you want the fabric to be a slightly stronger method of construction, it does mean hand sewing the eyelets, because what you do is you do not cut the fabric. So when you are doing metal eyelets, you will be cutting the threads of the fabric. If you are hand sewing them, what you do is you get an awl or something and basically work the awl through all the layers of the fabric, and you slowly put wider pointy sticks. I tend to end up using a pencil through, and what that does is it actually pushes the threads out. You then sew round it, which then means you haven't actually cut any of the threads of the corset itself. So it means that the fabric is still intact, so you still have that weave of the fabric and it's not going to have any problems fraying or anything else like that if you happen to use an eyelet. There are ways that you can actually make the holes in the fabric big enough that you can then put the metal eyelets in. I haven't had much success, but I know other people who have. A lot of it is patience, which I don't always have. So that's how we finish it off. And then next slide. Lacing. Lacing is the fun bit. Lacing is the bit that can make it look amazing and is how you get into and out of it. Fan lacing, which is the rainbow one here. This one, what you can't see is the front of it. So you basically have a set of ribbons that attach into a little square, and you pull the fan and then fasten it at the front. And it's really pretty, as you can see, really easy to do on your own. The only thing is you don't have that much adjustment. Fan lacing is a really quick way of actually doing the laces. The middle one is a spiral lace or a coil lace, and this is basically one piece which goes diagonally across a bit like you do the ladder shoelaces, and then the rest of it just goes round and round and round and round and round. And these are the lacings which are the hardest to do on your own. They are very pretty. They are the authentic way of doing it for 16th, 17th, early 18th century. Now, the one on the far end, which goes from neck all the way down, that is your standard shoelace crisscross. As you can see at the waist is actually where it's tied. It is difficult to see, but it's actually tied at the waist, so not in the middle, but at the smallest point. There are the loops there which go into the tie, it's just that the threads have all been passed into the back of it. And this is the easiest one if you're on your own, because you can feel the crosses and you can feel where you're pulling them to actually tighten and everything else. Next one. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to some of the other bits? Yes?
I thought of as we came along. When you make your twill,
Yeah.
do you have any suggestions for a good type of fabric or a bad type of fabric that you should or shouldn't use for a mop? Obviously not the nice fabric.
So when making a toil, I tend to use something that is fairly heavy. I generally use either calico or quilting cottons.
Okay.
The reasons for that is purely and simply the fact that both of them are fairly cheap, both of them are accessible, they're not something that I care particularly about, it's not going to cost me a fortune. The other thing is when I'm making a toil, I only do one. When I'm doing a toil, I tend to either do one or two, and then either sew the channels or, as I was saying before, actually creating the little strips to actually put the bones in. Again, that's to economise on the amount of fabric that I'm using, because I don't know if any of you have shopped for fabric recently. The cost of fabric has... Yeah, it's not a fun game getting fabric anymore. And then when you make the toil, when you're actually fitting it, it does help if you've got someone else who is there. But basically, when you're fitting it, you need to make sure that it's fitting nicely. So if you have, say, a massive gape at the top, you pinch out where you think where you've got those massive gaps and actually draw on your toil. So use pencil, pen, permanent marker, felt tip pen. I tend to use pins, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that because they tend to fall out and then you have to do some guesswork. If you do not have the straight line at the back or the front, wherever you're lacing it, then mark that you're not getting that so that you can actually alter the pattern so you get those straight line of lacing. Can you go back to the lacing page for me? So as you can see here, on this middle one, at the bottom is actually bigger than the top. This will suggest that either they have changed shape, which is always possible, or because that's actually on a dress form doesn't squish. you will not get a corset to fit properly on a dress form. Dress forms are fantastic, they're really useful for dressmaking, really useful for seeing how stuff is going to hang. However, your corset will not look good because it will never fit, because your stomach, your body will squish a little bit, whereas the corsets don't. And anyone who says that we don't use corsets nowadays is lying, because there is this wonderful thing called shapewear. There is shapewear for men, there is shapewear for women, there is shapewear for whatever you happen to be. This shapewear is actually based on the artistry of corsets. If you ever actually look at shapewear, you will find that it has all the panels the same, exactly the same as a corset. The reason why corsets kind of went out is because they are not as comfortable as wearing something with elastic in it. And during the kind of 1910, 1920, when the corsets were starting to go, they started to put Liberty bodices in, which is basically a very light corset, and then went to less and less fabric, because things like the wars had a massive effect on the cost and the amount of resources that there were, because corsetry has to be done for the individual. It's not something that can really be mass produced if you're wearing it every day, because, as I said, if you've got a badly fitted corset, it can hurt. Other uses for corsets at the moment are, they are actually used for a lot of spinal correction. They just tend to be made out of plastic cages. But a lot of the people with scoliosis will actually wear corsets of some form to actually help straighten and support their spine. A lot of people with low muscle tone will also get prescribed corsets to actually help with the stability of their back and their core as well. So it isn't something that is necessarily all in the past. There are still uses for them today. Personally, I like the kind of Victorian corsets when they support everything and they support the back, because I find them very comfortable. If you find your corset uncomfortable, one of the big things that will make a corset comfortable or uncomfortable is actually the length of the body. Because if you have a corset that is too long, you will find it starts digging into your hip bone. You will start finding out that it digs into you when you sit down, when you stand up. And if you sit down in the corset and you find that it's digging into your upper back and under the arms, it tends to mean that the corset itself is too long. You will find generally that the corsets that fit you well will be shorter than you imagine. And by shorter, I mean the distance from, so for me, I need a corset that stops about here. So the distance here is the depth that I'm talking about. You will find that that is a much shorter distance than you think. Because you have rigid bones, it's not something we're used to. And it's something that does take a little while to get used to. But they are incredibly comfortable things. And I love them to pieces, and I'm really frustrated that I couldn't find them to bring along. Now, if you want to come and have a look at some of the patterns I've got, both the patterns in the fashion book and the stays and corsets one that I was talking about, that's on my Kindle. So if you want to come and have a look at them, have a look at more of the boning, ask any questions, that's what we've got. Any other questions before we do that? Yeah?
You might have slightly answered this, but if one was lazy and trying to buy one in a shop, how do you know if it fits well quickly?
With difficulty. So first of all, try and move in it. So when you move in a corset, does it feel like it's moving away from you? Is it pulling your body in a way that you are not comfortable with? Can you sit down in it? Can you kneel in it? Can you jump up and down? And if you jump up and down, is it falling around your waist? Is the corset, if you twist, is the corset going with you? Is the corset staying in one place? If you bend over, is the corset staying where it is? Is it causing you any pain? If you are looking at the fashion corsets made with Ridgeline, these aren't going to give you the support. They're not necessarily going to give you the shape that you're after, because after a while, a combination of the fabrics and the Ridgeline, because fabric does stretch. One of the reasons why you need to use a very heavy, very densely woven fabric in the middle is because that fabric doesn't stretch, whereas most fabric, after time, will actually stretch out. So any fabric, any corsets that you make will mould and stretch to your body. It's the other reason why you shouldn't really share corsets. So even if you and your best mate are an identical size, so if you've got the identical sizes, say neck, shoulders, waist, hips, whatever, you will have different sizes in the middle. No two people are identical, and the problem is once you have worn your corset for a while, your corset will shape to you, and they are a very unique piece of clothing that if you share something that is specially made for you and you've worn it for a while, when you get it back it won't feel right, and you'll have to basically break it in again. It is possible to do. It's not a problem as such, but it's not recommended, because the other problem with most corsets is the hygiene issue. Because of course, what happens to metal if you get it wet? It rusts. Although this is all steel, it rusts. If you try and say put your lovely corset through the wash a couple of times, you will start to find that your bones will start to weaken and they won't do as good a job as they were, because what happens is they do start to rust. So when you have worn your corset, you do need to make sure that it's clean. So normally spot cleaning, sponge cleaning it, but don't immerse it in water because you don't really want the boning to get wet. When you've taken it off, you get rather sweaty in a corset because it doesn't really breathe. So you need to make sure that you hang your corset up inside out, basically, to make sure that you actually let it breathe and let that moisture out. But don't dry it in too high a temperature, and putting it in a tumble dryer is a really bad idea. It sounds like you've got a concrete mixer going. That wasn't me, that was my mate. And it is something that you do need to make sure that you take care of your corset. If you are buying them, if you are buying one that is made to measure, you are looking at a minimum of £200. More likely at the moment you're looking at £350, £400 for a made to measure corset. If you're looking, and that's for a basic one. If you're looking for something fancy, the most expensive one that one of my mates has bought recently was £3,500. Admittedly, that one was embroidered, hand embroidered, and is absolutely stunning, but it is still rather expensive. So you don't really want to damage them by putting them in the washing machine. Yes, that's one of the reasons why I like cable ties, because if you put a cable tie corset in the wash, it's fine. So long as you have made sure that you have finished all of your seams, made sure that you've finished all of the edges, you can stick your cable tied corset in the wash. It's not brilliant because the cable ties can bend, which then can get those little right angle diggy in bits that I was talking about earlier, but it's not the end of the world. Generally put it on a delicate cycle in a bag. Try and make sure that you've got something that means that it stays flat, but it's possible. I generally put the ones that I've made with cable ties into the bath, or the sink, or something like that, and immerse it, wash it, scrub it. You can do whatever you want to it, and it's fine because it's plastic in the middle. The same for the Ridgeline and the plastic boning. The synthetic whale boning is a no, and that is actually to do with the fact that I can't remember what it's actually made of, but it absorbs the water and it then goes a bit floppy. And if you then don't dry it out in exactly the right curves, you lose all the curve of the whalebone, and when you put it on again, it's a little bit ouch. Any other questions? Yeah?
So obviously you said about drying it.
Yeah.
About store. So I've got 3. I'm sorry, guys. Storage places you would say don't go near them at all for any corsets. And with flat steel, do you sand once you cut them with like tin snips? The ends. Do you sand them, or do you just put like the little silicone rubber caps on, and is that sufficient, or will they work their way through?
Right. Okay. I'm going to have to work through those one by one. I don't have a very good memory, so I
that's okay.
will
I've
need
written
to
them down
ask.
as well, 'cause I've forgotten one of the other ones I was going to ask.
Storage. Storage of corsets. Make sure it's dry. Don't put it in a plastic bag, because even if you think it's dry, there will probably be some form of moisture in it. And there is nothing worse than putting it in a plastic bag, pulling it out and discovering you've got mould. So I tend to keep mine in, I've got cotton bags that they just kind of live in. I have them generally rolled up once I'm absolutely certain that they are dry. That one tends to get thrown in a corner with the rest of the kit that it goes with, which is why it's looking quite so bedraggled. With some of the others, it depends on how often I wear them and what they're made of. So if they are made of silk, generally they are in with mothballs. Some of the ones that are made of cotton and everything else, they just go with the rest of my clothes in a drawer. But as I said, the only thing I'd really advise against is putting it in a plastic bag, but that goes for most clothing, especially if you're looking at anything with natural fibres. Plastic bags and clothes isn't a best idea. With synthetic clothes and plastic bags, it just tends to end up a little bit smelly if you leave it for too long and it's slightly damp. What was the next question?
Places that you would say absolutely steer clear of buying corsets from.
That's hard, because partly that depends on your shape. So
any that make them that are like, they're rubbish, they're just not very well made.
That can be anything. So the problem with corsets is the fact that yes, you can get corsets on Wish, you can get them on AliExpress, you can get them really cheap fashion corsets from eBay, wherever, which is what some of these are. They're fine, but they're not going to hold you like a corset does. They're not going to fit you, they're not going to create the shape that you're looking for.
Rather than to be functional.
Yeah, so you've got corsets which are designed to look pretty, that if you are a person with boobs, if they are ones that are designed to look pretty, they ain't going to hold you up, you're going to need to wear a bra. If, however, you get a well-made corset, whether it's one that is designed to literally flatten or uplift, if you have got a well-made corset that is fitted for you, you do not need to wear a bra with it. With that one, I can get away with not wearing a bra because it is actually fitted to me. It works, it's fine. It was the first one that I ever made, so it's not quite right, but it's a wearable toil. And I did it in about a day because I was desperate because I'd grown out my other one.
Have you made a pattern from that one to use in the future for making similar ones? Like
I have a different one.
Okay.
That one was actually made for me, so that pattern is one that was made specifically for me, based on one in there, I think, from memory. And it is something that when you've actually made alterations to a pattern, write them down. Again, speaking from experience, not just from corsets, if you make any alterations to a pattern, write them down, because when you come back to that pattern and go, oh, that pattern fit me really well when I made it last time, if you haven't written your alterations down, it won't fit you as well. Or you'll have changed shape. If you are making corsets in particular, because of the amount of time they take, so when I'm making a corset, as I said, I've made about 10 to 15 over the years. Each one, the shortest I can do a corset is 4.5 hours.
Is that including like cutting?
That's including cutting. On a good day, I can do it in 4.5 hours when everything goes right and it all works. On an average, depending on how complex the pieces are, if you've got one that is multiple pieces, multiple bones, then you're looking anything, as I said, the quickest is probably about 4 hours. The most I've ever spent on a corset is 45 hours. And that had a whole pile of embroidery, a whole pile of silk, lots of pretty stuff going on with it. And then you've got, if you are doing the eyelets by hand, that is one of the things that takes the time. So for me, each eyelet takes about half hour, 3/4 of an hour, because of the amount of time I go round, because I don't want to be redoing them. What was the next question?
Flat steel, cut it with tin
Oh, yeah.
strips. Got the little silicone bits that go on the end. Would you suggest sanding it or just putting the silicone bits on?
I really don't like being cut with pieces of metal. It hurts. And I have the type of skin that when I cut, I will scar. No matter what happens, I will scar. The minute my skin breaks, I will get a scar. So I sand, I tape, I put silicone on it, I then cover it in fabric, and then it goes into the boning tube.
How do you cover it in fabric? Do you just cut like a thin strip and just wrap it?
No, I actually basically create a tube, stick the bone in it, sew that up, and then stick the bone into the tube. It is frustrating because it helps if you use a silky fabric for that, because so that you can get them to slide in. But as I said, I don't like getting cut. Any other questions? No? If people want to come and have a look at the books, they're here. People want to have a look at the corsets I've got, they're here. And I've got various other bits and boning, and if you've got any questions that you don't want to ask in front of the group, that's fine too. Thank you very much for coming.